I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demography, or the study of human populations. Today I want to try to answer the question, should you feel guilty about not having kids? Now, we used to think that the world's biggest problem was overpopulation. Now it's something different. It's underpopulation, but specifically, it's underpopulation of the people who share your values. The world at large is never going to lack for unqualified parents and poorly educated parents and people without discipline who have kids. There are plenty of those parents around, and humanity will continue to produce babies through them. The problem is getting the more intelligent, the more disciplined, the more moral, the better suited parents to have children. These are precisely the people who are withdrawing from parenthood, who aren't doing it, and rightly so, because they are so intelligent and moral and well-centered. They see just what a big job that having kids is, how enormous the costs are and enormous the risks are, and they quite rightly say, well, this isn't the best way for me to use my resources, and I don't want to take the risk given the potential victimization of this person I bring into the world. So intelligent people are withdrawing from parenthood, which turns the world over essentially to the less intelligent people, the less disciplined people, if nothing else, the people who can't figure out how to work birth control. And this bodes poorly for the world at large, and that we're not going to have the leaders of tomorrow that we need because the leaders of today aren't having kids. So should you feel guilty about this? That here you are in your 30s and you haven't had kids yet and you don't want kids, yet you care about the future. You care about generations after you. The meddling mother is going to say, well, why don't you have kids? You need kids. It's your responsibility to have kids. Should you feel bad about that? And my short answer is no. You should not feel guilty about not having kids, but you should feel guilty about misusing your resources and not using your resources to improve future generations. In other words, you have an innate responsibility to improve the future conditions of humanity. You have to care about future generations, but having a kid may or may not be the best avenue to pursue that. So what is this innate responsibility that I speak of? And this is hard for me to explain. It's something you either have or you don't. You either care about what happens after you've left this earth or you don't. This is something that is part of your personality, part of your upbringing, and if you don't have it, I can't give it to you. But assuming that you do have it, that you do want a better world for future generations, then you've got to come up with a plan that is going to be executed within your lifetime to somehow improve the world in the future. And one of these plans might be to have a child and to raise that child in optimal circumstances so that they become a great leader even after you're gone. There's a certain satisfaction in, being on your deathbed and realizing that you're going to die, you're not participating in the world anymore, but you have left behind some kind of legacy in the form of other people who will carry on whatever your values were and whatever your work was. If you bear a child yourself and raise them from scratch, then you have an opportunity to instill in them your values, which presumably will continue after you're gone. But I also recognize this is a very risky operation. When you have a child, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. You can do everything right. You can try to instill all these values into this person, and they could still go in their own direction and do things that you wouldn't approve of, in which case the whole operation is in vain. So I recognize the risks and problems of having children, and I would not make you feel bad if you don't. What I would do is make you feel bad if you are wasting time, if you are taking your most precious resources, mainly your time and your energy and your thought, and putting them into things that aren't really important. If you buy a boat and you spend all your weekends out boating, you are wasting precious resources that could be applied to the betterment of mankind. Now, I can't tell you what form the betterment of mankind should take, but I can tell you that owning a boat is not part of it. So assuming that you do care about future generations, the big challenge then is how best to help them. And that's a really complicated question, and there is no easy answer to that question. And you may need a whole lifetime to figure out what it is that you should be doing to improve the world after you're gone. I can't give you the answer to that. I can only tell you the things that are not going to improve the world after you're gone, and one of them is owning a boat. The question of how you should improve humanity is one that changes over time. You become more and more concerned about it as you get older. When you're young, you're really just concerned about survival and figuring out what you should be doing to make a living, and just figuring out how the world works, because you got to figure out how the world works before you know how to help it. But as you get older, you see that there's a deadline coming, that at some point you know you're going to die. And as that deadline gets closer and closer and closer, you think more and more about, what is my legacy going to be? What am I going to leave behind? Because as death approaches, your legacy is really all you have to give your life meaning. And frankly, that's my personal position right now. I had a bout with cancer last year and barely survived. Now that I'm healthy, I'm more and more concerned about, what is my legacy? What should I do in the few years that I have left to secure in some way an improvement to humanity? Now, I'd like to be recognized for whatever I do. I'd like people to say, Glenn Campbell, he did something important. But actually, that's secondary. The most important thing to me is to actually do something important, do something lasting that improves conditions after I'm gone. And actually, that is one of the main motivations for this demographic doom project that I'm working on, that I want to improve the world. And to do this, I'm trying to create this theoretical framework for understanding some important issues in humanity, the high-level demographic issues in humanity. So what personally makes me feel guilty is to spend time on things that I know darn well are not important. I have to ask myself, is this really improving my knowledge? Is this really increasing my effectiveness? And for most forms of entertainment, the answer is no. So I don't engage in most forms of entertainment. Things are different when you're young. You want a broad understanding of all of humanity, and you want to see all the great movies of the past, and you want to travel so you can experience other cultures. And there's lots of sampling and grazing when you're young. But as you get older and your knowledge base increases, you're more focused on production. You want to produce things that improve the world, and you want to cut out all of the things that are getting in the way. Now, I don't feel particularly bad about not having kids. Now, the spoiler alert is that I can't have kids because I don't have a womb to incubate them in, and I don't have access to a womb right now. But even if I did, I wouldn't feel bad right now about not having kids, because I realize with all the instabilities of my life, I would not have been able to give them a good life. So I have to shift my attention to other things other than childbearing that I think will improve the condition of humanity. Now, the thing that I'm doing isn't necessarily the right thing for you to do, because each person has their own individual skills and their individual assets, and your challenge is how to leverage those assets to get the maximum benefit for mankind. And you may think it's, campaigning for a certain presidential candidate. Well, maybe that is, or maybe that isn't the best way to use your resources. The only thing sure is that you do have resources. You have certain unique resources, perhaps that only you have access to. And your job is to find a way to use those resources to make the world a better place after you're gone. Now, I don't believe in heaven or in any of the gods that men have created for themselves, but I do believe it's a useful analogy. if God did exist, what would he or she expect of you? And I think that if they were a compassionate, omniscient, intelligent God, they would simply expect you to do the best you can with your resources to somehow improve your community over time. That way you're actually covering all your bases, because if it turns out there is a God who's going to judge you after death, all they can judge you on is whether you've done your best. The next question is, what is your best? What is the thing you should be doing? And that's actually part of the challenge. It's not just doing good, it's figuring out over the course of your life what good is. And preparing for the next generation is a pretty good starting point. You want there to be a next generation. You want there to be a healthy world, a world that is better off than if you had never existed. And part of that could be having children, but there's also a lot of other ways that you can improve the world. An analogy would be climate change. Every intelligent person's realized that this is a real thing. Climate change is the result of human activity over a long period of time, and it's a real crisis for the planet. But having this realization doesn't necessarily dictate what you should do. For example, climate change leads to rising sea levels and perhaps the flooding of your community. Perhaps the levees are breached and your community gets flooded. And one course of action is to get everyone out there with buckets and start bailing, trying to reduce the flood by dumping as much water as possible out over the other side of the levee, which is one solution, but it's not necessarily the most effective solution. In other words, whenever you're facing a big problem, there is the microscopic solution, which is bailing as fast as you can, and there is a macroscopic solution where you're trying to look at the causes, the greater causes of the crisis. And the trouble with global warming is that it's been going on for so long, we've been dumping carbon into the air for so long, that even if we do everything right, even if we change all of our emission standards and stop burning fossil fuels, the problem is still there. It's built up over 150 years. It's not going to go away. Addressing these things just in the microscopic, that is by bailing or by reducing emissions, you're not really solving the problem. The problem is really much bigger, and it's a much more complex thing than simply reducing greenhouse gases or building bigger levees. And I can't tell you right now what the answers to global warming are. They are a combination of trying to prevent it in the future and adapting to it as it is right now, because you're not going to stop sea level rise. It's going to keep going, and it's going to flood a lot of major cities, and you can't change that. And if you focus all of your attention on just reducing emissions, then you're not addressing the real adaptation issues that we have. So I can't give you one simple solution to global warming. And likewise, I can't give you one simple solution to the demographic crises that we are facing. Yes, you can devote your life to raising children, but that is addressing things on the microscopic level. It's not addressing things on the macroscopic level, which is what are the conditions that these children are coming into. And I realize right now that having a child is a big and complicated issue. It is my contention that we have a big economic crash coming up in the 2020s. And who would want to bring children into that? If this was 1929 and you knew there was a Great Depression coming, you would not want to have children knowing that you're bringing them into a less than optimal situation. So there is very good grounds right now for not having children. And there's good grounds for saying that the world isn't structurally ready to have children. And if you're going to take that position, at least you need to start working on the structure. What are the structural changes we need to make so that we can have children in the future and our society, the kind of society we want, is actually sustainable? So once you decide what it is you should be doing, you want to get the most you can out of whatever resources you have. And this naturally draws you to the macroscopic, to seeing things from the highest possible angle. For example, Bill Gates is operating from the macroscopic level. He is a big donor. He's a billionaire and a big donor to various causes. So he's looking at things from the global perspective. And in theory, that's the way you can get the most effect from whatever your resources are. You want your project to be as big as possible so you get the maximum effect from whatever it is you're doing. However, I don't think you can neglect the microscopic. For example, if you're a minister of education in some government, I don't think you can be effective in that job if you haven't also been a teacher teaching individual students. Because if you haven't done that, then you're just not sensitized to some of the main issues in education. And likewise, I have some doubts about how effective Bill Gates can be because he personally has never dealt with the microscopic. I think for your philosophical health, you have to have your finger in both pies. Your life should consist not just of macro strategizing, but you also need to get your fingers dirty with actual human interactions, because to really understand how the whole world works, you have to understand how individuals work. And you need to have dabbled with these microscopic relationships if you hope to make good macroscopic decisions. So in my project, I talk a lot about child rearing and ideal families and how families work. And I really wouldn't be equipped to do that if I hadn't spent some time raising a family. Now, it was a relatively short period, about 5 years, where I actually participated in the raising of children. But having done that, I have insight into how families work and the sort of things that are practical for making families work. Otherwise, you're just dealing in pure theory. You're just dealing in pure idealism, and that tends to have tragic results. If your idealism isn't tempered by real experience, then whatever plans you cook up are unlikely to be successful. So good psychic nutrition in your life is to be working toward important goals, but to be doing it both in the macroscopic level and on the microscopic level. You need to be seeing the big picture, but you also need to understand the small picture and how the small picture works. And to do that, you have to have real experience with that small picture. So the world has massive demographic problems that are only going to get worse. And part of those problems is the fact that good people, the people who are best equipped to be parents, aren't having kids. But the fact that we recognize this does not necessarily dictate a solution. It doesn't mean that we should coerce more people into having kids, whether that coercion is some sort of government pressure or some psychological pressure from a mother-in-law. This is a big, complex problem. Having kids may indeed be your way to serve mankind, but this is such a big problem that it can't just be solved on the microscopic level. You have to also look at the structural issues that are keeping people from having children and perhaps making radical changes to the structure. Just like global warming, the fact that global warming is real does not dictate the appropriate course of action that you should be taking. It's different for different people. Some people are addressing climate change by biking to work instead of driving. But that's not the right solution for everyone. Some people work on the microscopic. Some people work on the macroscopic. You don't need to feel guilty about not working on the microscopic. What you do need to feel guilty about is not using your resources well, not doing the best you can to improve the world after you're gone. Because in the end, this is all you got. When you're on your deathbed, the only accounting you have with the universe is the world you leave behind.